Recently, a patron at the museum, having seen all the grand houses nearby, asked me if that meant that Healdsburg has always been a ritzy place. Well, good question. In fact, when I was a kid, Healdsburg was a pretty podunk farm town. Thought it always had been. But I've done some research, and it turns out today isn't the first time Healdsburg has been thriving and a little bit fancy. In fact, in the Victorian age and the early 20th century, Healdsburg was pretty posh. I call it Halcyon Healdsburg. Hi, I'm Joanne Taeuffer, one of the Healdsburg Museum docents, and today's History Talk is going to show you around that old-time version of our town, Fancy Healdsburg version 1.0. Now, in the early days, Healdsburg had at least three things that would allow it to thrive. Agriculture, which has always been the basis of our economy, lumber, an important economic driver up until the mid-20th century, and as always, tourism based on our beautiful landscape, fine climate, and proximity to the Bay Area population centers. And when the train arrived in 1871, the town's success was certain. Now we could get agricultural products and lumber to market, and tourists could get here without the sometimes hair-raising stagecoach rides over mountain roads. And here's how it grew. During the 10 years after its founding, the town tripled in size from 300 to almost 1,000. And then it continued to grow steadily through the 1920 census. These were the good years. In fact, Eric Drew, my frequent source of the best historical tidbits, said that in 1915, Healdsburg was the fifth wealthiest city in California. So let's walk around downtown Halcyon Healdsburg and take a look at some of the grand buildings of this thriving town, some of which are long gone and some of which you can still see today. Let's start at the dead center of town, the plaza. Originally, it was parking for horse and buggies. Just like present-day Healdsburg, old-time Healdsburg seemed to have had a parking problem. But soon it became the gathering place it is today. And perhaps the building that best expresses the ethos of Halcyon Healdsburg is the old City Hall. This building at Matheson and Center Streets says a lot about how Healdsburg saw itself in its early heyday. In 1886, the town decided it was time to dedicate a city hall. The city floated a bond for $10,000 to build a Romanesque-style city hall. This was for a town of 1,000 people. It was designed by the architects Samuel and Joseph Catham Newsom, who had won a design competition. Now, the Newsom brothers of San Francisco also designed the famous Carson Mansion in Eureka, and also two Oakland City Halls, a Berkeley City Hall, and the Napa Valley Opera House. This style was called Richardsonian Romanesque, after H. Richardson, and it was a style that only made it to the West Coast in the late 1880s. So it was very avant-garde, probably one of the first of its style in California. And the size was said to have been large enough to serve the needs of a town 3 times its size. To me, this says the town thinks it's a force to be reckoned with. Now, most of you never saw this building. I have seen it. In fact, my Bluebird and Campfire Grill groups held meetings upstairs in the old courtrooms there before it was torn down to make way for this simple one-story mid-century modern city hall on the same site. And today this is the site of Acorn Cafe and retail space. Also important in bustling Halcyon Healdsburg was West Street, or what we now call Healdsburg Avenue, already the main street of town. Among the buildings there were 2 big hotels, both built before the town was incorporated. In the foreground here is the Union Hotel, and in the background it's the Sodiomi Hotel, built by Harmon Heald's brother. And the street was a busy shopping street. I remember a later version of this West Street in the 1970s. I remember it as having 3 bars, a farmer's bar, a bracero bar, and a Hell's Angel bar. On Saturday night, it was pickup truck, hog, hog, hog. Now, there's nothing left of this version of West Street because the City Redevelopment Agency raised the whole block in 1981, to make way for the 21st century version of the same uses: the Hotel Healdsburg, Dry Creek Kitchen, and lots of upscale shopping and services. Maybe more like the original West Street of Halcyon Healdsburg than the 1970s version. In fact, current-day Healdsburg around the plaza has a lot in common with Halcyon Healdsburg, and here are some of the buildings still standing and lending their character to our town today. This is the Cruise Building, built in 1900, designed by a San Francisco architect and constructed with no costs spared. And it's still recognizable today on Matheson Street. And this beautiful, dignified, I'm going to say fancy Greek Revival building on Center and Plaza Streets was built after the existing buildings were badly damaged in the 1906 earthquake. This was the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, and it replaced a small single-story bank building that had been just next door. This expresses the confidence of the town even in the wake of the earthquake. A very Halcyon Healdsburg edifice. And a grand Carnegie Library in 1911. It became the museum in 1990. The story of this building is really what's important. So the town got a grant from the Carnegie Foundation for a new library. It was going to be a one-story library, but the fathers of the town didn't think that was good enough for Healdsburg. They wrote back and said, we need more money. And the foundation said, you're just a small town, you don't need more money. But the fathers of the town found the money to make this a two-story building, a temple to books and learning, and appropriately fancy for Halcyon Healdsburg. But of course, people came to Healdsburg for more than the grand buildings. Halcyon Healdsburg knew how to have fun. No TV, no internet, but lots of festivals, music, live performances, dances, midnight suppers, and traveling around Northern California. Halcyon Healdsburg had great mojo for events, which were known throughout the region. For instance, the 1877 medieval tournament on May Day. It was a revival of an event that had been established by Roderick Matheson 20 years earlier. A king, actually Mayor Colonel Norton, presided over a medieval-style tournament between knights, all dressed in costumes they'd gone to San Francisco to procure. And here's the bottom line. The tournament drew an estimated crowd of 6,000 people to a town whose population was fewer than 1,000. We have some pretty big festivals and events today. They don't draw 6 times our population. And the medieval festival morphed into the Floral Festival. One highlight of this festival was the selection of the Queen and her court. Bay Area newspapers would track the weeks-long voting. And in 1896, when Healdsburg native Alice Haig was pronounced the winner, she had more than 5,000 votes out of almost 11,000 votes total. And after the turn of the last century, the main festival moved to the river with a water festival, a water carnival with floats, games, contests, and yes, a queen. To learn more about the Victorian era festivals, and there were more, watch Fran Schoenbeck's presentation on the History Talks YouTube channel. Today, we have the Raven Theater for live performances and True West for cinema. In Halcyon Healdsburg, they had performances of all kinds at Truett's Opera House on Center Street, across from what is now the police station. I don't know how much actual opera was performed there, but there were certainly minstrel shows and the town band. Members of both groups are shown here in front of the building. And here are members of the Healdsburg Dramatic Society in a play presented at Truett's Theater in 1895. Today's Healdsburg has Tuesday music in the plaza. Halcyon Healdsburg had the local Sodiomi band, which played in the plaza on Saturday nights. And the residents of old-time Healdsburg had a lot of other ways to have fun. Even before the automobile made travel easier, Healdsburg residents took every opportunity to do some traveling. At the turn of the 20th century, the good citizens of Healdsburg made periodic visits to San Francisco, as these tintypes attest. The Cliff House was one of the sites they took in. This is John and May Congleton Taeuffer, my grandparents, and some of the Congleton relatives at the Cliff House. And another tradition was going to the coast, which was often a multi-day event. My great-grandmother Agnes Call Wilson and her husband would spend extended visits at the ocean for camping and fishing. One visit to Dillon's Beach was made with friends Mr. and Mrs. John Long in their newfangled auto in 1910. Now, another aspect of Halcyon Healdsburg life was lodge participation for both socializing and philanthropy. This was the golden age of fraternalism. The Knights of Pythias, Oddfellows, Masons, and Foresters, among others, were prominent here. And here's an example of the kind of social events that these lodges organized. In December 1897, the Foresters' Masquerade Ball was described in the Healdsburg Tribune. The Grand March of Costumes was at 9:30, followed by dancing until 11:30, then prizes for the best costumes, and a late supper that went on until 1 a.m. Then more dancing. How did these people stay up so late? Didn't somebody have to get up in the morning and milk the cow? Family was central to social life in Halcyon Healdsburg. This is May Taeuffer and John Congleton, and two of their children, Ernest and Dorothy, with their cousin Helen Wilson. Dinner parties were regular events and served as a way to keep in touch with the extended family and with neighbors. And these events were always recorded in the newspaper with lists of guests. The evening parties usually featured competitive card playing, like whist and pedro, and they would typically end with a sumptuous feast served at midnight. Afternoon gatherings also often included entertainment by the musically inclined ladies. And house guests were a regular thing during this time. Family and friends who had moved away would come to stay, often for weeks or even longer, and reciprocal visits would be in order. And the fashion of the day was fun. Here's one of the fashions from the turn of the last century: hats. They were hugely popular, and here are some fashionable examples and a few silly ones, all modeled by Taeuffer family and friends. And of course, Halcyon Healdsburg was a great place for visitors, including spa resorts, downtown accommodations, and ultimately summer homes on the river. Hot springs were hot in the mid to late 1800s. The geysers, Skaggs Hot Springs, Lytton Springs, for visitors, but also used by locals who went out just to take the waters. In 1875, there were 3,500 visitors to the geysers resort. And not just the hoi polloi. Famous visitors included William Jennings Bryant, Luther Burbank, Ulysses S. Grant, Horace Greeley, Jack London, J. Pierpont Morgan, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Mark Twain, and the Prince of Wales. Aside from the spa resorts, much tourism was focused on the river. Here are the 1915 bathing beauties at the river at Camp Rose on Fitch Mountain. And there were lots of places to stay in Healdsburg, but how did visitors learn about them? There was no internet, but the railroad published an annual booklet with information about places to stay along the train lines. And here are some pages from the 1908 edition. There are pages talking about the Geysers Resort and Skaggs Springs, and also downtown hotels in Healdsburg and elsewhere. Geyserville and Cloverdale had even more hotels than we did. But wait, there's more. All of the Airbnb and VRBOs in town are listed, along with other smaller lodgings. For instance, here's the Riverside Villa, a small resort at the Y-shaped intersection where Mason Street hits First Street, which today is a mobile home park by the same name. and smaller accommodations like the Orange Villa in Healdsburg. It says it's 2 blocks from the depot, plenty of shade, hammocks, croquet grounds, and if preferred, a tent to sleep in. Can accommodate 10. Or Denio's on Matheson Street. It's a 5-minute walk from the depot. The bus runs to the door, and it's 2.5 blocks from the plaza. Already promoting walking distance to the plaza. A short distance from Russian River with good fishing and bathing. Large, comfortable rooms, newly furnished, piano, hot and cold water, telephone, electric lights, and all modern conveniences. And at about the same time, Healdsburg's status as a vacation destination reaches a new level. On Fitch Mountain, resorts like the Villa Chanticleer, which was much admired by the French community in San Francisco. And settlements like Camp Rose, which along with Del Rio Woods was ultimately subdivided for mostly Bay Area people to build their own summer homes. Now, back to the original observation. The housing stock in Healdsburg that dates from Halcyon Healdsburg tells us a lot of the story of its time. Let's see who lived there, who had the money to buy those homes. And here are 3 of the most dignified early homes on North Street. The Marshall House, built in 1870, he was the town blacksmith. The Ransom Powell House, 1871, he was a 49er, but he didn't get rich in the gold mines. Instead, he profited from hauling freight, and after coming to Healdsburg in 1856, he launched a successful retail, agriculture, banking, and real estate career, and the last of which made him his fortune. And then in 1882, between the 2 houses, the Meyer House, built for the most prominent businessman in town, who had grocery store and other large commercial properties. Now, has anyone seen Meyer's name anywhere around town? Well, if you keep an eye out on Healdsburg Avenue north of the plaza, you'll see the old signage preserved from his stores above today's storefronts. Now here are 2 more Matheson Street houses. These are both owned by well-known merchants. Built in 1895, 403 Matheson is A.W. Garrett's house. This is the founder of Garrett's Hardware. Some say the facade of this Queen Anne house is as crowded as the aisles of Garrett's were back in the day when it was on the plaza in a very small building. Every inch is decorated. And this is Eli Bush's house. Eli Bush was a prominent local merchant. He was a partner in Rosenberg and Bush department store, a mainstay of the town from its start in 1865 to its closure in 1985. The house style was fairly avant-garde, representing the transition from Queen Anne to neoclassical bungalow. And here's the George Alexander house. George Alexander was the 10th child of Cyrus and Rufina Alexander, the first white settlers in the area. Cyrus had a huge landholding in the valley that bears his name because he had been the overseer of the Sodiomi land grant for the Fitch family. So George made his fortune the old-fashioned way. Yes, he inherited it. He was also active in ag affairs. He was a director of the Healdsburg National Bank, and he was a city and high school trustee, along with being an enthusiastic member of the Sodiomi band. And here are 2 of my favorite houses. I think of this as the queen of the houses in town. They were built and owned by people who weren't merchants. The Swisher house was built by Dr. Swisher, who came to town, married a local girl, and he and Mrs. Swisher built this big house on Johnson Street. They had big parties, and they were among the first owners of automobile in the town. They were definitely bon vivants. And probably the king of houses is the Passalacqua house, built in 1914 by an Italian immigrant, a farmer and winemaker. In the later generations, the family members, many became attorneys and judges. When you grew up in a house that looks like a courthouse, maybe that's what happens. And here's the Scatina Craftsman, 1914, on Matheson Street. It was owned by a grape grower and winemaker. He was one of a number of farmers who had houses in town and out on their ranches. And why? Well, it turns out that their children could go to school at the one-room schoolhouses out in the country until they were in finished 8th grade. But if they wanted to go to high school, they had to be in town to go to school. And so if they could afford it, farmers would have a townhouse for their kids to live in during the week while they went to school. Now, here's one last house that comes with a story about another aspect of Halcyon Healdsburg, how this town became a particular kind of destination and how it gained an institution that even present-day Healdsburg can't match. This was the Ellen White House. Ellen White was the prophetess, counselor, and leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was formed in the 1860s. She lived in a small farm on Dry Creek and later on this house on Powell. And during the 1870s, Healdsburg became an Adventist destination because it was the site of many camp meetings of the First Adventist Church west of the Mississippi, and it was where their prophetess was living. And something else that is an indication of the status of Halcyon Healdsburg that we don't even have today, a college. Founded by the Adventists and originally called Healdsburg College, it was in the area between Fitchin University and Matheson and North Streets. Now, this was not the University of California for sure. In these early days, it provided a Seventh-day Adventist education focused on religion, education, and science, with early programs including biblical and teacher studies and also vocational training for things like blacksmithing, printing, and agriculture, but still a college. As parents moved to Healdsburg to educate their children at the college, the number of Seventh-day Adventists grew until eventually 20% of the city's population was Adventist. And in 1877, the Sonoma County Atlas depicts an area west of town as Advent Town. Now, eventually, the college was renamed Pacific Union College and moved to Angwin, and the Adventist population in Healdsburg declined. The college building became the high school. But by the late 19-teens, there was a disturbance in the force. The town faced the Spanish flu, World War I, and Prohibition, which upended the nascent wine industry. Many years of prosperity were coming to an end. In fact, Healdsburg wouldn't be as prosperous as it had been in its halcyon years until the beginning of the next century. But that's a tale for another time. So, thanks for listening.